G'day, Year 11s. I wanted to just talk through the extended response and have a look at the criteria. I want to go to the teams page if I could, and hopefully I can scroll down here to where I get to legal studies. Just double checking everyone is comfortable where everything is. So we go to files, and all this stuff for the extended response is the extended response materials. Now, this is the same task that you have done already. So if we have a look at the question, so the short answer questions first. Don't get too worried about the short answer questions. I'll stick to the ones I've given you for your revision. We have had a look at about 3 or 4 of them and used their model answers. So it says, this is the question: analyse source 1 to 6, determine the nature and scope of the legal issue, and examine 2 viewpoints. Evaluate how representative the current parliament is and make a decision how this may be improved in future parliaments. So evaluate and make a decision. What I really want to focus on with this is the criteria, right, that we've got here. So the first criteria is just the short answers. Don't get too worried about that. There are 2 criteria then with the extended response: analysing and evaluating. So in your extended response, you've got to analyse a legal situation, a legal issue, and evaluate. And there's very specific things that we want to see as we're marking the answer. And that's why I want to go through this, and then we're going to have a look at how well they do that. So to analyse, we have to use legal concepts, principles, and processes to determine the nature and scope of a legal issue. So in this case, the legal issue is how representative is the Parliament of Australia compared to the population. That's the legal issue. We have to interpret the legal information to examine different viewpoints. So we have to think about it from more than one perspective. We've talked a little bit in other situations about stakeholders. This isn't just about stakeholders, it's about just different viewpoints. So let's see if we can see different viewpoints and use of evidence to support the analysis. That might be things both that you know and bring into the exam, and also the sources and referencing the sources. So that's what we've got to do to get an A in analysing. In evaluating, we've got to present relevant legal alternatives. Now, I don't think that question was entirely clear that they wanted you to give legal alternatives. They do. You have to meet this part of the criteria. So make sure the question in the exam will be phrased in a similar way. Make sure you're doing that. Justify the decision through the discerning use of legal criteria. Legal criteria might be around, say, in this case, it's talking about how representative is the parliament. Right? So that's a reasonable legal criteria in itself. So think about what legal criteria are being used and discuss the implications of the decision. Now, what I want to do, if I can, let's go back and have a look then at the response that they give and see how well they work with that. So this is the model response here, and it's annotated, so it's going to take it back to the answers. Now, don't get too worried about the short answer, but you can see they've marked here that they have a very high regard for the way this response analyses and evaluates. This is your part A, don't worry about that. This is the start of part B. Now, I just want to flick through the whole thing. The whole thing is less than a page. They haven't spent a lot of words in getting an answer that meets the criteria. But let's have a look now. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. Let's have a look now at what we've got. So the legal issue, no great introduction. Straight into the legal issue of representation is a concern for governments of Australian law. So that's the issue. Straight on to some perceptive application of legal concepts. The data demonstrates Parliament has less women than the workforce, and also they talk about a lack of diversity. The legal problem of lack of diversity is connected with Australia's 2-party political system. So that's where they've gone with that, by the majority power in the lower house and significant power in the upper house. So they've looked at legal concepts there, like the way Parliament is structured. So this is the analysing criteria, the first part of the analysing criteria. Okay, now interpretation of legal information to perceptively examine different viewpoints. So you can see they've actually outlined one viewpoint of the lack of diversity problem is that candidate pre-selection. So the fact that the way parties choose their candidates is a problem. So one viewpoint there, but they've gone straight into a second viewpoint, is that the two-party system impedes representation where MPs where blindly support party policy. So two different viewpoints. One viewpoint is that the problem is because of the way candidates are pre-selected. The second viewpoint is that the two-party system means that there's not any real diversity of thought. Anyway, and talk about members crossing the floor, so voting with the other side and having retaliation and so on. Right, now, discerning use of evidence to support the analysis. So they referred to the different sources that are in that folder that we started with. You can have a look at different sources to support their analysis. So that's the first criteria looked at. Two different viewpoints, evidence used to support the analysis, and legal concepts around the scope of a perceptive application of legal concepts around the scope of the problem, which is the issue of representative government. So that's the first criteria we looked at. The second criteria now asks us to evaluate relevant legal alternatives presented leading to an insightful decision. And again, they've been really clear as to what they're doing here. One alternative is to amend the Oath of Allegiance, right? So they talk about that as the first possibility, to refocus MPs' attention towards gender equal electorates, so they're better representing their electorate. Okay. Then they go to a second alternative. On the other hand, or you could easily just say a second alternative is to implement quota arrangements, because that way then more women would be selected at the pre-selection level, so they'd be standing as candidates and going from there. So it's really clear what the two different alternatives are there. There are some criteria that are used, right? And the criteria is how representative would things be. So what are the implications of each alternative? And the main criteria they're looking at is representativeness. How many women are either of these things going to go? And they talk about the fact that the first issue, the Oath of Allegiance, doesn't really reduce party influence, and it's going to be difficult to uphold. Whereas then they say for the quota system, they suggest a quota system could ensure that more women survive the pre-selection process. So they're saying that based on that criteria, quota system will be a little more effective. Right? And there's implications discussed in both situations. So there's those relative legal alternatives that are presented, and now we come to a decision. The evaluation concludes that while both alternatives have the potential to increase the representation of women in Parliament, a decision to increase a female quota for pre-selection can achieve just and equitable outcomes in a more efficient legal manner than one which requires a referendum. So remembering that if you were going to go and change the Oath of Allegiance, you're changing the Constitution, you have to have a referendum to do that. So there's nice discussion of the decision, how it's going to work, the criteria of which is going to be more representative, and it looks at some of the implications, like it's simpler to implement. So that's what I wanted to emphasise, just to pull apart those two criteria in the model response. Just to remind you, even though it doesn't necessarily ask for what's for everything there, make sure you're thinking about meeting the criteria as your answer, and the criteria will be exactly the same for your response on Tuesday. You're going to have to think about a legal problem, the scope of the problem. You're going to have to look at it from different perspectives. You're going to have to use, so that's the different perspectives here. So let's go through these things again. You're going to have to apply legal concepts to work out the scope of a problem, in this case, representation in Parliament. You're going to have to look at different viewpoints. So one viewpoint was that it's a problem of pre-selection here. The other viewpoint was that it's a problem of the two-party system. So they're both there. And you have to use evidence to support the analysis. And you can see there they've used sources to justify their positions. Then you've got to evaluate. So you've got to present legal alternatives. And this is probably the part that's not always the clearest. But make sure you're thinking about what are legal alternatives. So one alternative is to amend the oath of allegiance, which requires a referendum. Another alternative is to increase the quota arrangements. So there's a justification of those things based on criteria. The criteria they used here is representativeness, which is going to give you a better outcome to make Parliament more representative, discussing some of the implications, and then coming to a decision after the two criteria have been presented, coming to a decision that includes reference to criteria and discussing the implications of the decision. So look, just wanted to spend a little bit of time to emphasise that for you. Good luck with the exam Tuesday. I look forward to catching up with you then. Cheers.